Hi, friend. I'm so glad you are here for another episode of the Happy Whole You podcast. And today's guest is Dr. Robert Melillo, a world-renowned expert in brain health, specializing in childhood and adult neurological disorders. He's a clinician, professor, brain researcher, and best-selling author of Disconnected Kids. He focuses on ADHD, autism, OCD, tics, anxiety, and other developmental disorders. Dr. Melillo is dedicated to bringing brain function to its highest level, improving behavior and physical health. His innovative multi-modality approach is absolutely life-changing, and the Melillo Method has transformed thousands of lives. And so join us as we explore his groundbreaking work and unique insights into the brain. This was a conversation that I will never forget, and I swear I could interview him multiple times. So I hope you enjoy this. All right, Dr. Robert Melillo, thank you for joining me on the Happy Whole You podcast.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
So when I discovered you and who you are and what you're doing in the world, I got so excited. And before we dive into all that, can you just share with everyone a little bit about yourself and what are you most passionate about?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm a clinician. I started out my career over 30 years ago, really in chiropractic medicine. I got a diplomate subspecialty in neurology and rehabilitation. I then got a degree later on in neuropsychology, and I have a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience. So it's been a lifelong journey of academics. I've been a postgraduate professor of child development and neurology for, again, 30 years. I've written about, I think, 100 scientific papers that we've published. I have 8 best-selling books. And I have 2 clinics in New York, one on Long Island, one in New York City. And I'm very, very active with that. And what I'm very passionate about is really understanding the importance of the developing brain, because to me, it is the foundation of all health. And I think that we're seeing an epidemic rise of all different types of brain-related issues, especially in children. And so for me, I can't be any more passionate than that, especially when I work with kids that are non-speaking and we can get them to speak. I don't, that fuels me, understanding the brain at the highest level.
Yes. Yeah, it's amazing what has been going on. I was actually thinking about like the autism rates, and I live in California, and I just UC San Diego in March of 2023 found that 1 in 36 kids have autism in California, which is up from it was 1 in 44 in like 2001, and I think the national average is like 1 in 68 or something crazy like that. But it used to be like 30 years ago, what, 1 in 10,000 kids?
Yeah.
So it's like, what is happening? Can you tell us what is going on here?
Yeah, well, my third book is called Autism, the Scientific Truth. And it's really about, it starts off with, are we actually facing an epidemic? Because, there's different ideas out there. Some people will say, well, we're just recognizing it more. And what we look at is what's called prevalence and incidence. Prevalence is the statistics of how many people are diagnosed with it. Incidence is really more, the real number, not just what we're seeing, but, how many people actually have it. And so, many people were saying that, well, the prevalence of us recognizing it is going up, but there isn't actually an increased incidence. But I did a lot of extensive research on this and spoke to some of the best epidemiologists in the world. And it's very clear that incidence and prevalence are both increasing. So part of it, only about maybe 50%, is because we're recognizing it better or diagnosing it earlier. but there's at least 50% of that increase is completely unexplained by that. So that means that there's real more people, and really all you have to do is just speak to anybody in education or in over the past, it's been there for the past 20 or 30 years. And, if you ask them, are the numbers going up? And they look at you like, yes, absolutely. There's so many more kids. And I mean, even for yourself, you walk around the airport or whatever, 15, 20 years ago, you didn't hardly see any kids that fit the autism spectrum. Now, everywhere you go, you can't. And, kids on the autism spectrum, especially the non-speaking kids, it's really hard to misdiagnose that. It's not like you miss, right? So, and that's like the fastest growing population. So we are seeing an epidemic. The numbers right now from the CDC are 1 in 36. It's about 1 in 28 boys, but actually those are old. So those statistics are actually from a few years ago. They always come out like 3 or 4 or 5 years later. So actually, we're probably even much lower than that. And as you said, 30 years ago it was 1 in 10,000. And now, you're looking at 1 in 28. I mean, we're looking at right now about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 kids at least, probably 1 in 4 that have some sort of disability diagnosis that's related to brain development.
Which is wild because evolutionary, other than like 2,000 years ago, do we know of the brain really shifting from an evolution standpoint and how the brain develops? Or is this, could this be environmental? I mean, I would think like, well, it would have to be environmental, or like, what are you finding? Like, why is this happening?
Yeah, it has to. As a matter of fact, it's funny you say evolution. This was my first textbook, and you see it's neurobehavioral disorders from an evolutionary perspective. So from the very beginning, when I wrote that book in 2004, actually I started writing it in 1999, I looked at the brain and brain development from the very beginning of time. Like, when did brains first show up on this planet? Why did they show up? As you said, there's no such thing as a genetic epidemic. So we know that there is, in the vast majority of kids with autism, ADHD, any of these disorders, there is no single gene mutation, not like it is in Down syndrome or Fragile X or something. And most people believe it's a genetic mutation. It's not. It's what we call epigenetic, which means that environmental factors are influencing the expression of genes. And the genes that are most prevalent, 85% of our genes are there for brain development and growth. And they are the most sensitive genes to environmental factors because as humans, we have the most unique brains on the planet, that we have the most immature brain at birth. And the reason for that is that we have the biggest brain per body size for primates, but because we're the only bipedal primates, we have the smallest birth canal. So we have big heads with small birth canals. That's a problem. And no other animal has that issue. And so most other animals, when they're born, their brain's 80, 90% of the adult size. With humans, about 20% when we're born, because it can't grow too fast. So our genes are very sensitive, and we have developed an adaptation that keeps the brain relatively small in the womb, because if it grows too fast, it won't get out. So once it gets out, the genes need to be able to sense I'm outside, and so they get bombarded by light and sound and gravity and temperature and all of this sensory input, and that turns on genes and causes the brain to grow, and we go from 20% to 90% over the first 3 years. And so those genes that regulate brain development are very susceptible. It makes us the most adaptable brain, but it also means that if we don't have the right environmental influences, at the right time, then our brains are more likely to go off track with development. And that's exactly what our research is showing is what's happening. There's no damage or injury or pathology. There's just this abnormal growth process and timing of that growth that gets altered, and then that causes these developmental delays and imbalances.
Yeah, and that goes so with the growth process of the brain, I want to talk about the primitive reflex of how the brain develops. But first, just for the listeners to go back, because I just got done with a 4-day conference on human consciousness and biology and evolution with Bruce Lipton and some other amazing speakers, scientists, researchers. And the whole aspect of epigenetics, and this wasn't even really widely known until the early 2000s, is our genes get turned on or off based on environmental issues. And like Bruce Lipton says, there's not a single gene that causes cancer. There's genes that are correlated with cancer, but they're not causing it. So it's the environment. And I want the listeners to really take that in, because our environments are everything. And like you were saying, sound, light, being outside, movement, the food we're putting in our body, this is directly impacting how our genetics are expressing. And literally, it's either causing disease or it's preventing it. So I just want to make that very, very clear for the listeners. And if we could get into that primitive reflex, like how the brain's developing. So we come out of the womb and we're only 20%, right? Our brains are only 20%. So what's happening in those first 3 years with the brain?
Right. So, as you said, and you said it very well, we're really, as the genes that regulate brain development are the most sensitive. And so they're the most susceptible to either good or bad environmental influences. And so what drives it all is movement. Some of the best researchers in the world looking at evolution of brains, have really done a good job of describing this. I did it in my book, but basically living things that don't move don't have brains. That's the bottom line. So when something moved under its own power, it needed a brain to be able to do that, because then you have decisions to make and predictions to make. And, you can't just move haphazardly. It has to be purposeful. And there's a decision: do I go towards or away, which basically forms the platform of all human behavior. Approach and avoidance. The left brain governs approach behavior, the right brain is avoidance behavior. So we need to move. But again, humans are the only animals that can't get up and walk and run right from the time they're born. We won't walk for a year if we're in the best case scenario. So we need to move, but yet the motor cortex is not even formed yet. So we don't have any control over movement. So in our brainstem, we have what we call primitive reflexes. These are basic reflexive movements that allow us to do what we need to do to grow and thrive and survive, like rooting and sucking so we can feed ourselves. But these primitive reflexes come online before birth, most of them. And most moms are aware of what we call pre-birth movements. And that really is primitive reflexes. So they're supposed to come online. The right brain is developing first in the womb and for the first 3 years. And so these primitive reflexes that come from the lower part of our brainstem become active, and they allow the baby to miraculously get into the right position to be born. At the end of the 3rd trimester, they turn upside down and backwards and get down into the birth canal. And they should do that without the cord getting wrapped around their neck. And these are primitive reflexes. If they're not in the right position, if they're in a breech position, if they're not low enough to really induce and break the water or whatever, and if they have the cord wrapped around their neck, we can assume that these pre-birth movements aren't coming on the way they're supposed to. And that means the reflexes are not coming on. And that's because the genes are already delayed in their development and their expression. So the brain is a little bit delayed from where it should be, and there's a timing mismatch. Then these reflexes are used to get out of the birth canal. So twisting down the birth canal, squeezing through. The end of the birth process really should be mostly the baby pushing themselves out. If a baby gets stuck, because, they're not going any further and they need forceps or vacuum extraction, it's because, again, these reflexes aren't there. And then the first milestone outside the womb for me is, can the baby latch on to breastfeed if the mom chooses to do that? About 85–90% of the kids we work with, especially non-speaking, they couldn't latch effectively to begin with. Some not at all. And that shows us, right, again, that there's low tone, there's immaturity. And then once you miss that, you then have to look at these other milestones, which are very important. A baby should roll over. We use these reflexes to do that. And then crawl on their belly and do the commando crawl. And then, like I had two kids today that they did the worm movement. That's not the way it's supposed to happen.
Supposed to be opposite.
Right. And then they did, both of them didn't crawl on their hands and knees. One crawled but dragged a leg, which again shows that there's this asymmetry in their movement from the beginning. And then, they should sit up, stand up, pull up. And right around 12 months, all kids should walk a few steps, say a few words, and have good pointing and eye contact and waving and smiling at that point. If they don't go through those stages like that, if they skip them, if they're shorter, if they do it in an unusual way, there's an issue. And it's affecting the way the brain is growing and moving. Because as I said, movement is what engages our senses, is what brings in that environmental influence and what causes our brain to grow. And as we move along, we should get more and more complex movement. And then at 12 months, when we stand up and walk and talk, these reflexes need to go away. If they don't go away, if they don't come on time, they don't go away on time. And now what we've shown with our research is that it holds the brain back and it prevents the brain from effectively going to the next stage. And in kids, let's say with autism, that are geniuses with their left brain, like every one of them, the left brain comes online too early and then it crashes the right brain. And this is often where we see the regressions of skills or complete loss of skills, or they don't respond to the name anymore. And then once this imbalance is established the wrong way, it doesn't correct. Mm-hmm. And then the three, around 2.5 to 3, the left brain fully kicks in. And now once that's established, we see that the right brain isn't fully maturing and developing, and this developmental imbalance is the actual problem.
I gotcha. Okay. I have so many questions. Okay, I want to go back to the positioning. I've given birth twice, and I did it vaginally. And when I went into labor for the first time with my son, the doctor came in and I wasn't progressing fast enough. Of course, it was like 3 a.m. and he wanted to use a vacuum to get my son out. And I said, absolutely not. I believe in my biology. I believe in what my body knows to do. And I actually was dilated all the way to an 8, and I wasn't going to get an epidural. And they're like, no, we can do this now. The anesthesiologist is here. Like, let's do it now. And I didn't know then what I know now. That was 15 years ago. And I remember just leaning over, my legs were convulsing and shaking, and they were sticking a needle in my spine. And I look back at that and I just cringe. But after that happened, everything regressed in the delivery. Everything got slower. Okay, but I'm wondering, are C-sections is there any correlation with C-sections in this happening, because we're interrupting that natural biological response to encourage those reflexes to go, for the baby to turn, for them to come down the birth canal, and for them to come out. So are we interrupting that system?
Absolutely. So we know, that there, in my book, looking at, okay, is there an epidemic? Yes. And why? And talking about the difference between genetic and epigenetic and environmental factors. And we identified about, 50 well-known environmental factors that increase the risk significantly of having a child with a disability. And so you can't, talk about proving prevention, but you can say there is a correlation between things. And we know that any sort of procedure with birth, if there's any sort of problem with the birth process, if there's a C-section, that it elevates the risk of having a child with a disability significantly. And yes, I believe that the main reason for that is one, if they need a C-section, why? Usually it's because the baby's not in the right position or they feel like the head's going to be too big. Well, why would that be? Well, because these birth movements aren't coming on the way they're supposed to, or the mother's not progressing because the baby's not really doing what they're supposed to do in the birth process. And so that means for me, it already tells us that the development of the brain at that point is not really on track. And that would lead to that. So then they're supposed to use these reflexes, as you said, going through the birth canal. And that's one of the, first and primary reasons. If they don't go through it, they don't use it. So the way the reflexes work is as they go through different stages, they use these reflexes, which helps to build the brain. And then that also helps these reflexes to fade away. So using them, they have to be there on time, go through the milestone, and then the milestone eliminates the reflex, and then there's a new reflex, and there's more complex reflexes. And then at 12, they should all be, at 12 months, they should all be gone. Now, if they're not using them in any way, they don't go away and they stay on. If they're not coming on when they should, and they're not being used when they should, they're not going to go away when they should. And that's what ultimately, so, the gun is kind of loaded in the womb with the way that the brain is being developed. But then when they're not going through every time they miss a stage, they get further and further and further behind. And this usually results in an imbalance. And then that their brain is developmentally immature, but then they have this imbalance in this maturity. And the imbalance is where all the symptoms live, whether it's the right or the left, which side, which networks are too strong, which are too delayed. So, you're exactly right. And there are many countries in the world where they just routinely do C-sections for no reason. They just do it because I think it's easier, it's cheaper.
Yeah, that's what they told me with my son. They're like, "Do you want to schedule a C-section?" And I was like, wait a minute, I have a due date." Like, I was very naive as to, it was like, oh, it was the convenience for the doctor and, just a working mom and all of that. And I remember I considered it, and then I was like, this doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel right.
Oh, and if you've ever seen what a C-section looks like, it's
Oh, it's now that I know.
very aggressive. I mean, I just had a kid that was just here, and many kids we see, they end up having torticollises at birth, and they end up getting a flat head on one side. And that right from the beginning also is a big issue.
Right.
When we talk about movement, the head is what leads movement in babies. And if you affect the neck in one way or the other, there's more input to the brain from the neck than any other area of the body. And so if there's an asymmetry from the beginning, and if there's a torticollis, it means there's a neck injury at birth. That's what it means 100% of the time. And so that needs to be dealt with as quickly as possible because that will create an imbalance in the way that they're moving, the way that they're perceiving the world, the way that they're activating their senses. And then that further tips the balance in the wrong direction.
Mm. I interviewed a lady who does cranial sacral work right after birth for children. And so talking to you and hearing what you're saying and knowing what she does, it's like, wow, that would be a great thing to have someone like that right after you give birth for that support with your child. And as we come through the birth canal, the skull, I mean, it all happens for a reason. I'm like, let's stay with biology, right? Like, let's not change it up. So I would say, this is me like thinking the worst case scenario setting your child up would be getting a C-section. They're not able to breastfeed, giving them a phone or some type of device at a very early age because they're just like this and they're not playing, they're not crossing, they're not doing those things. So the sedentary, and then I don't know, then you're also not, they're not getting the breast milk, so they're not getting the good nutrition. Like that cascade would be like, I feel like that is like a big thing.
Huge. And you said, those are fairly simple things. Now, the good news, because I don't want any moms or anybody out there who had a C-section or, and felt like, the thing or anything like that. And the good news is we can change this at any point, but the earlier you intervene, the better, right? Like you said, like doing craniosacral at birth can be a good idea. If a kid has a torticollis, I mean, the only people that should be doing that really, I mean, are really chiropractors that are trained to really do those types of adjustments. Just stretching the neck and everything isn't really the best way to deal with that. And then, really understanding if they miss a milestone, it's a red flag from the very beginning. And the first one is if they can't latch already, if they didn't get out of the womb, if they, again, the reason why they had the C-section. So what we need to do is we need to stimulate them in a way to get these reflexes to come on, get them back on track, and get the reflexes to go away when they're supposed to. And to me, these are the easiest things, but over and over, pediatricians tell people that the milestones don't matter anymore. They're not that big of a deal. And, because they really don't know what to do about it. And they feel like just keeping the mom calm is the most important thing to do, and that they hope that the kid will catch up. They never really do. And even if they, again, and the kids that are most susceptible, I always say, are actually the most gifted. The stronger you are on one side of your brain and the other, the more talent you have, the more you get this from your family around you, the more likely you are to have an imbalance because you're more vulnerable, right? With strengths come vulnerabilities. And so, these kids might go on and actually be pretty bright or brilliant in certain areas, but they have clear deficits in others. And they may look good, and parents may say, yeah, my kid, was delayed in those things, but they're fine. Or, they're okay. They're a C student, a B student, they're average. Well, maybe your kid, if you look around, maybe the other children in their family are straight A's or really talented or great athletes or musicians, and this one child doesn't seem to have those. And maybe they are disabled, but they're so talented that they're able to compensate. And it doesn't look like they're significantly delayed, but they're not reaching their full potential. They're not the best version of themselves. If there was any sort of milestone issue, I can almost guarantee you that that person, as good as they may be, is not the best version and really has not met their full potential. One of the things that, and Bruce Lipton talks about this as well, is that, we have the potential of multiple versions of ourselves, right? Anybody has the possible, depending on just how our genes are turned on or off, we all have the potential to be one of the greatest people that's ever lived. We also have the potential to be one of the most severely disabled people that's ever been around without any gene mutations or actual damage or anything, just based on the way our genes become expressed in the best version of ourselves. And as parents, of course, what we want is our kids to become the best version. We don't want to change them. We want them to be who they are, but the best version. And if they miss these milestones or have delays, they're not the best version. I mean, and so that's something that I want people to think about.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So, what are some things if a mom is out there, it's like, okay, I had a C-section, my child did not latch, so I've missed some milestones. What are some interventions that they can start doing now to start to help that child?
The first most important thing is to start to stimulate the primitive reflexes. So this is where right now I'm kind of the world expert on this. I publish more than just about anybody. I'm the only one that's ever done a pretty large age match control randomized double blind study looking at retained primitive reflexes in children, adolescents, and adults on the autism spectrum. We published those papers last year and the year before. We, it's some of the best journals in the world. We had, I think, 7 or 8 papers in one year. We have 2 or 3 papers coming out soon on this. And we've developed what I believe the most effective way to get rid of the reflexes. And most of the time, most people, if they are aware of it, They are trying to get kids to do certain exercises, like developmental movement exercises early on. And that's fine. And I used to do that as well. But when you're working with kids, let's say on the autism spectrum, that are really have so disconnected from their body, so low muscle tone that they can't really move their body, they're not in control of it purposefully, there's no way they're going to do that. So what we designed was how to stimulate the reflexes the way we would test for it in an exam. And we teach parents how to stimulate their kids' reflexes over and over and over and over at a high repetition. It only takes about 5 minutes, and we only focus on about 9 key reflexes that I think is really all you need to look at. Other people look at 30 or 40 reflexes. I don't think you need to do that. And what we find is that by stimulating the reflexes, you're making them go away, and then you're removing the blockage, right? So there's a blockage, something keeping the brain down and keeping it in a more immature state and keeping their movements relatively simplistic. We need to move in a complex way to build a complex brain. So we need to get rid of these reflexes. So that's really one of the simple things. My most recent edition of my book, Disconnected Kids, just came out this past summer. And I have a whole 2 new chapters in it on primitive reflexes and on instructions of how to stimulate these reflexes in your child to get rid of them. And that is the single most important foundational thing anybody can do. But then, if they're there, there's also an imbalance. And now you have to also address that imbalance. So the reflexes is one step, but you're not going to get rid of the reflexes if you don't address the imbalance, but you're not going to address the imbalance fully if you don't get rid of the reflexes. So those 2 things are intimately involved. And that's really the key, unique foundation of my work and what we do with the Melillo Method.
Okay. So when you do working on the brain balance, so you working on the reflexes, what are you doing with the brain balance? Are you guys doing, do you do biofeedback, neurofeedback, or
We do down the road, meaning we start with what we call bottom-up therapy, right? So there's certain, the brain starts from the medulla, from the bottom of the brainstem. That's on when we're born. That's where the primitive reflexes come from. That's also where the nuclei that regulate gut development and function and the immune system come to. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, the foundation of them is in that same area in the medulla. The sympathetic nervous system is online first when we're born. And the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight. When it's on, it, prevents the closing up of the gut. It prevents the production of acid or digestive enzymes or reduces blood flow because it's taking the blood flow and it's shunting it to our muscles and our brain to early develop. But then as our brain develops, as the bottom of the brain matures, as the reflexes go away, the parasympathetic nuclei come online, and that inhibits it. That's called the rest and digest. Now the gut closes up because we're born with the leaky gut. It closes up when we start eating solid food. And then we start producing acid and enzymes, which creates the proper pH balance for the right bacteria to live and kills bad bacteria and fungus and yeast and candida and parasites that should never be able to live in our gut. And then blood flow now absorb, and we start getting more muscular contractions to move this all along. And then from there, once the reflexes are gone, and this has happened at about a year, then we get to the next stages of development, and then the brain comes down and regulates everything in the right and left brain, because the right brain develops first in the first 3 years, then the left brain, and this creates the difference. So this is called vertical integration, bottom up, top down, and then horizontal. That's driven by sensory and motor activity. So we first get rid of the reflexes, then we promote, core stability, strength, body awareness, balance, muscle tone. We use sensory stimulation, but we have to correct this imbalance. So we direct things like light and sound and different frequencies of sound and light and even smells and vibration and touch, all directed towards one side of the brain to make that brain grow and mature. And then we may do other things with different types of units like transcranial units or lasers to inhibit the other side. So we start from the bottom up, and then we add top down. So things like neurofeedback are things we do later on. I don't think any kid should have that as a first line treatment because you need to get rid of these reflexes first. You need to work on the brainstem. And then, so when you look at things like behavioral interventions or academic training or, any of that cognitive skill training, all of that has a place, but it's later on or in conjunction with bottom up and top down. But then we also have to do it in an unbalanced way to create balance.
Wow. That is so informative. And you made me think of something. I didn't know that you are in a sympathetic fight or flight nervous system response, which means that once you get out of that, that's when the gut heals. So, with you saying that, kids that come in here that I'm seeing with ADHD, autism, different things like that, oftentimes they have a lot of gut issues. So they didn't get that milestone to close that up. So now they're more susceptible to parasites and candidas and pathogens. You just blew my mind. This makes more sense.
Even, experts in functional medicine. And again, some of my best friends, I teach, functional neuroimmunology at a high level. Some of my best friends are in the functional medicine world, and everybody's taught that it starts in the gut. It doesn't start in the gut. It starts in the brainstem and in the imbalance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic, and then that affects the gut. We start out life with a leaky gut. Most people don't know that, right? And that is for a very important purpose. We don't have an adaptive immune system yet. A baby is not producing their own antibodies yet.
Coming from the mother's breast milk.
Exactly. So those are large immunoglobulin proteins that wouldn't get through a normal closed up mature stomach lining. So the lining has to be open. But at that point, we're not eating solid foods. It should just be breast milk or formula. And so, we don't need enzymes. We don't need acid. It just gets absorbed. We don't need a lot of blood flow. We don't need a lot of contractions in our gut. But once they start eating something, then what happens is now we need to break that down. We need to close the gut up so that we're not getting large proteins to filter through. And we need blood flow. But if the parasympathetic vagal system isn't coming online, and if the reflexes are there, it has not come online. And the right brain governs parasympathetic, the left brain is more sympathetic, and the sympathetic and the left brain activate the immune system and produce inflammation. The right brain is what suppresses the immune response and produces anti-inflammation. So we know that these kids are all in this sympathetically dominant state. They're prone to too much inflammation. They have overreactive immune systems. So right from early on, they may get eczema. They have reflux because they have sensitivity to dairy almost right from the beginning. They, have an overactive immune response, and, they have too much inflammation, and this is what's happening, and their gut is still open. And until we get rid of the reflexes and cause that maturity, you can stimulate the vagus nerve all you want. If you don't mature the medulla and the brain and the right brain, you're not going to have appropriate parasympathetic, so that you're not going to have digestive enzymes and acid. You're not going to have the right pH balance. Again, if a kid has candida, if a kid has parasites or fungus or mold, why? They shouldn't live in the gut because they should be killed by the acid. Or the immune system in the gut. So, and if you have one kid in the family that is mold and everybody's exposed to mold and they don't have a problem with mold, it's not about the mold, it's about the individual.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you're blowing my mind. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's like, so with that, there are kids, babies that, are they getting food too early? Are they getting solids too early? Because with what you're saying, I'm thinking in my mind, really solids around 12 months or when they start walking. And there's some people that are giving solids to kids at, 6 months old, 4 months old. I mean, do you have any opinion on this? This is just what's coming up for me after you're talking about the gut, and I'm thinking, oh, well,
You know, this is why looking at the milestones is so important, and we ignore it. Because if these milestones aren't proceeding, then everything is staying in a more immature state. Their gut is in an immature state. Their immune system is in an immature state, because ultimately this is what regulates their immune system and their inflammation versus anti-inflammation, sickness behavior, getting sick, getting a fever. Is actually a neurological reflex mediated by the parasympathetic nervous system. I have a number of kids. I just saw a kid yesterday. His father is a doctor here in New York City, and the mother's a lawyer. And at the end of it, she was like, "I've been looking for 18 years for answers, and nobody has ever told me this. I knew my son had inflammation from the very beginning. As soon as they introduced milk, he started to have severe reflux. They took it away, it went away. They brought it back in for some reason, and then he got really bad, very thick eczema. And then he had a vaccination, and then everything crashed, right? Because his immune system was so overreactive. But he'd missed his milestones. He didn't crawl. All of these things were already there, but he really had this severe problem. And this child, he had a problem with his gut and his immune system early on. So what we see is that these are there, and if, as far as introducing food partly helps to stimulate that parasympathetic nervous system. But again, like you said, if that's not maturing, and then we're giving them food and we're not producing acid and enzymes, and the gut is still open, then that is something, especially when the immune system is overactive. And what these parents talked about was that their son, whenever he got a fever, he would speak so much better. He was so much, and that's because when you get sick and you get a fever, and a number of parents talk about this, you actually activate the parasympathetic nervous system and an area in the right brain called the insula, the ultimate regulator of the autonomic and immune system in the brain. And that when that gets better, you can actually speak better, because that's the reason why they're not speaking.
Wow, that's incredible. So if they're not hitting their milestones and then they go in and get a vaccination, which has an immune response, could this suggest why we're seeing kids go in and they're talking, and then they get their vaccine, and then all of a sudden they're regressing?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that come along with that. But, when the left brain comes online too early, and when we're in this sympathetically dominant state, the immune system is overreactive. And what often happens is we get what's called a Th2 dominance, where the B cells become hypersensitized and the antibodies become like hyper sticky. And what happens is we start producing antibodies too easily. And now, again, if our gut is still immature and it's not closed, and we're not really breaking the food down fully, and we're getting these larger protein molecules to come through, this is where we develop food sensitivities because of this. But again, all of this is being regulated because of the brain and the immune system. And so, when we find that, they're not meeting these milestones and this isn't developing, then, the gut isn't maturing, the parasympathetic system isn't coming on the way it should. It's not regulating this response. And therefore, that may trigger food sensitivities and it may trigger, inflammation. And so now they have this hypersensitive immune response. And now and we know that because when they just have dairy, they get eczema, right? Which is an autoimmune disease, right? So we know that their immune system is dysregulated and overactive. Now you give them a vaccine that is designed to trigger antibodies, but the antibodies are reacting too much. So that activates the Th17 and Th9 or Th23 systems, which is the inflammatory system. And then that inflammation goes through the body and goes to the brain and can affect them. But again, that's a secondary effect. Now, at the same time, right around 18 months to 20 months to 2 years, most kids are going through the biggest growth spurt they will go through. And if the left brain has come online too early and the immune system is already overactive, during that growth spurt, it comes on even more and it can crash the right brain, which is, where we see a regression. So if all of this is happening at the same time, where you're seeing this crashing of the right brain, the left brain coming online too strong, too much inflammation, and now we're triggering more inflammation, this perfect storm comes together, and that's what happens in regressive autism in what our research seems to be showing.
Wow. So with the increase in what we're seeing with autism, obviously this is environmental. So I don't think nobody knows what causes autism, but what I'm hearing is it's a combination of things that could be happening. C-section, not latching on, not meeting these milestones, the gut lining isn't healed, we're introducing foods, getting vaccines, triggering an immune response that the body is not even ready or prepared for. And all this happens because the brain hasn't developed sequentially how it's supposed to.
Correct. Yeah. Well, first of all, the idea that we don't know what causes autism isn't really true. I mean, we know that it's environmentally driven and it's lifestyle driven, right? It's like saying we know the cause of cardiovascular disease. We don't know the cause of diabetes. We do know what it is, right? And we do know, like I said in my book, I went through at least 50 environmental factors that we know significantly elevate the risk of having a child with autism. Now, again, we can't say correlation isn't causation, right? But we know that there are environmental factors are altering development and gene development, especially brain development, especially what we call functional connectivity in the brain. And that is the cause, right? It's not genetic mutations. It's not, it's not a toxic insult to the brain. And again, autism, vaccines don't cause autism. If they caused autism, then every child who was ever vaccinated would have autism. But it certainly might trigger more inflammation, which could make the symptoms worse. But they already missed most of their milestones, right? So the idea that there is no one silver bullet or any of it, but once they're off track in the womb and when they're born, they tend to keep on going off track. And if we don't put them back on track, they're going to get more and more and more imbalanced. And these are some of the most brilliant people in the world, right? So we also live in a world that's favoring more and more the left brain. We live in a left brain world. I don't know if you're familiar with Ian McGilchrist. These are pretty well-known psychiatrists out of the UK. He's written a number of books like I have on brain asymmetry. And he does more philosophical type stuff about how, everything we do now, our education, psychology, everything we do is being driven towards this left brain world. Technology, as you said, any sort of technology like this, and especially things like video games or things that are on the phone, they drive the left brain. They're literally designed to drive these dopaminergic pathways in the left brain. And if you do it in a child, the left brain shouldn't be online before 3. If a baby before the age of 3 is looking at a phone, you're bringing their left brain on too early, which means it's going to stop the right brain from developing. And the right brain is all about socialization, interpersonal relationship, emotional regulation, feeling connected to our body, connecting to other people, wisdom, getting the full picture. The right brain is actually bigger than the left. It's actually smarter than the left. It takes in all types of information at the same time and instantly, subconsciously knows the answer. And because we don't have words with the right brain, people have thought, well, it's not the smart brain. The left brain is the intellectual brain, but the left brain just collects data and facts and lines it up and organizes it and uses it, but it doesn't really understand it. It doesn't put it into context. It has knowledge, but it doesn't have wisdom. The right brain is so important to attachment. It's the main brain that governs attachment, personal interaction. It is the most important part of our brain. And that is not developing. And what we're seeing is more and more any psychopathology in any age is really related to dysfunction in right brain development, either delays or overactivity. Either way, if we're not finding the right level, it's almost all being driven by that. And all mental health issues, even in adults, really start in childhood. I mean, that's what we know now.
Yeah. Wow. So fascinating. I could talk to you for hours. I wanted to talk to you about ADHD and dyslexia and so many other things, but I guess we'll have to do that on another episode. Thank you so much.
The underlying factors that we talked about is the same thing in ADHD and dyslexia. They're just different levels, different networks involved. The dyslexia is a left brain delay with the right brain staying online too long. ADHD, traditional ADHD, is more of a right brain deficit like autism.
I've been diagnosed with both. So what does that say about me?
And I can tell you a lot about yourself. You've probably have struggled with, if you don't mind me saying these things,
Yeah, go for it.
what your right brain is very overactive, and you're probably extremely talented and gifted in some creative way, obviously interpersonal way. You're incredibly empathetic, but you probably struggled with anxiety most of your life because you probably feel like you're so overwhelmed by other people's emotions, and you feel like you're being judged, probably when you were a young girl especially, and you tend to judge yourself more harshly and tend to struggle with self-esteem, even though you're incredibly talented and bright woman, but you don't feel that way, and that you may feel like a sense of danger. You feel guilt and shame and embarrassment really easily. Being embarrassed as a child might have been one of your biggest fears, or ultimately being rejected.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes with dyslexia.
Okay. Yeah, that was totally me, but I wouldn't have called it like anxiety as we see it today, but my outlet was sports.
Right.
As long as I could play a sport, it was like I could get away of the outside world, but I had to be the best.
Right.
I had to be the best. So I would practice like OCD practice.
Yeah, well, the right brain there's certain subtypes of right brain and left brain abilities. We think of the right brain as being creative, and it is, but so's the left, but in a different way. But, one subtype is athlete, dancer, kinesthetic. It's more of a right brain dominant. Great athletes. That's where the dumb jock theory comes from, that they struggle with reading or learning or remembering facts, which is what the left brain is good. And the right brain people are so fast with their brain, and they know things right away, but to have to slow it down to explain it step by step in a left brain world is really very hard. And that's what dyslexia is. That's what learning disabilities, or dyscalculia is. And for athletes is one. You can get people that are obviously artists or creative types, designers, musicians. My daughter struggled with a lot of this issue, and she's like a top singer-songwriter. Zach Brown produced her album. He struggled with dyslexia. Ed Sheeran struggled with dyslexia. Thomas Edison, inventor, all of this right brain type of stuff. And so that's where that all comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you pegged me right on. That's me all the way. Oh, very interesting. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you for joining me on the Happy Whole You podcast. And again, I could talk to you for hours. If you could let everyone know where they can find you, your books, or they can follow you on social and all the good things.
Yeah, drrobertmelillo.com is my website. We have a lot of information on there and different courses and different things that people can tap into. Really active on Instagram at Dr. Robert Melillo, and Facebook, but really more Instagram, a little bit on Twitter. My books are, available anywhere books are sold. Disconnected Kids is in 18 languages, just came out with the 3rd edition. I have 2 podcasts that I do. One is called the Melillo Method podcast, Everything Brain. And then I do a podcast geared towards the creative world, which is called The Right Brain with my daughter in Nashville. We do that. And it's the WRITE brain, the right brain. And I have like I said, over 100 papers. People can go just Google it, or go on Google Scholar or PubMed, and they can get the papers. They're all open access.
Thank you.
2 practices in New York, and again, they can make appointments right through the website or contact us directly.
Wonderful. Dr. Melillo, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.